in honor of its 250th anniversary.
TV Internacional.
Nelson Mandela, a free...
Let's meet up on air and discover a desert island.
Join me in Antarctica, the coldest place on Earth.
Come to Boston with me and find out if no two snowflakes are alike.
Follow this
And penguins, too.
on the new season of 3-2-1 Contact. 3, 2, 1.
Contact.
This is WMFE TV, Channel 24 Orlando, offering only the best for 25 years.
We have now reached a point where the principal threats to our security are no longer ideological differences or military aggression, but the degradation of the planet. It's climate change and soil erosion and ozone depletion that are now threatening not only our future, but that of our children and our grandchildren.
In this half hour, Lester Brown talks about the state of the world. I'm Bill Moyers.
A World of Ideas with Bill Moyers. Funding for this program is provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, a catalyst for change. Corporate underwriting is provided by General Motors and its Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac, GMC truck divisions, and GMAC. General Motors, committed to excellence.
There is more air pollution this year than last. There is more water pollution, more toxic waste, more poisoned wildlife. There are fewer trees this year than last, and that means more desert and less land to grow food to feed a world population that keeps growing. As one of the founders of the environmental movement, Lester Brown has drawn our attention to the daily deterioration of our planet. As founder of the World Watch Institute, he has suggested solutions for a wide variety of environmental problems. The Institute has published over 90 papers on such topics as nuclear power and the potential of the bicycle, on deforestation and soil erosion, on tobacco and world health. This year, they issued the 7th State of the World, an assessment of the planet's health. I talked with Lester Brown in New York.
The environmental movement's been an astonishing propaganda success. But what has it actually achieved? By your own measure, between the first Earth Day in 1970 and the most recent Earth Day in 1990, the world's population increased by over 1.5 billion people. The Earth lost 500 million acres of trees, 480 billion tons of topsoil. Carbon dioxide in the air increased by 9%. Thousands of plant and animal species have disappeared. I mean, what do you really have to show for the last 20 years?
Mm-hmm. If we look at the condition of the planet, every major indicator shows deterioration since 1970. No question about that. What we see is the gap between what we need to do and what we are doing to reverse the degradation of the planet continuing to widen.
What's your explanation for why the environmental leaders have not been able to persuade the politicians to do more, given the almost indisputable character of so much of the evidence that has been marshaled?
Well, for one thing, enough people have to understand an issue in order to bring about changes in policies. And we change our perceptions and our behavior in response to new information and new experiences. The scientists have told us that the ozone layer is being depleted. And as a result of that information, we actually have an international accord to begin phasing out the use of chlorofluorocarbons, the family of chemicals that's doing the damage. That's an important step in the right direction. People respond to information. Much of what is happening so fast that we literally are having difficulty absorbing and understanding the consequences of our actions. For example, you mentioned that since 1970 the world has added 1.5 billion people. To be precise, 1.6 billion people. That's more people than we added during the 20 centuries preceding this one. It's very difficult to understand.
Because I don't look out and see all those people. I still see just the same number of people who are in my circle of daily habit and in my neighborhood or in my community. I don't see that exponential growth.
And you don't see so many of the consequences. As one who's been very much involved in international agriculture over the years, I travel a lot in third world countries and have been since 1956. And what I see is not only the population growth, the villages with 2 or 3 times as many people in them today as say 30 years ago, but also the deforestation, the land degradation, the soil erosion, the desertification.
You can actually see the loss of those 500 million acres of trees.
You can see a lot of it.
500 million acres, that's equivalent to the United States east of the Mississippi.
It's a lot of trees. It's a big area of forest, and we're continuing to lose forests now each year.
And the consequence is?
The consequence is increased flooding, soil erosion, and land degradation. I think it was a French philosopher who said the forests precede civilization, the deserts follow, and in a sense that's true.
In fact, you conclude we are losing the battle to save the planet.
We are. And what we have to hope, and I think Earth Day 90 provides at least some basis for being hopeful, is that we can that enough of us will become concerned about what's happening to the planet, enough people will be concerned about the future of the planet. We can begin to turn some of these trends around.
Yes, but there's still a limited appeal. National Review, the conservative journal published by Bill Buckley, recently ran an article in which it said that the environmental movement remains altogether too elitist, and it took certain satisfaction, I think, in polls that show that middle and working class Americans are either indifferent to or ignorant of these environmental concerns.
The issue has often been presented as the economy or the environment, and so working class people, the blue collar people that were interviewed for this poll often see it that way. But that's almost a trivialization of the issue. The real issue is, can we protect the environmental support systems on which the global economy depends? If we cannot, then we're obviously in trouble. And one of the interesting sort of contradictions that we see today is that if you read the economic pages of any major newspaper or business magazine, you get the feeling that the world is doing reasonably well. I mean, we have problems with debt here and there, in some countries inflation, but overall the world output of goods and services is increasing, international trade is expanding. But if you look at the environmental indicators, they all show that the world is heading for serious trouble. I mean, if the environmental trends that we've been discussing, such as deforestation or ozone depletion or soil erosion, climate change, continue, they will undermine the economic system.
Those are indisputable, but there is conflict in some of the scientific advice. Just recently, Science magazine came out with a report by 2 acknowledged and reputable scientists saying that they've studied the satellites that have been the most reliable source of gathering information about the warming of the Earth, and they said that there is no long-term trend evident for the warming of the Earth's atmosphere. And so a lot of people who have not yet joined the environmental movement look at that and say, well, I don't know what to get alarmed about. I can't believe the science.
Right. What this article said was that they now have satellite data, which are the most accurate data that we have on global average temperatures. And what they said was that they now have that database established for the 1980s. We have 10 years of data. And what they said was that 10 years does not show a long-term trend. And that is certainly true. You can't determine a long-term trend based on 10 years. And what the scientists were trying to do was to be cautious in presenting the data so that people wouldn't read too much into it. And as a result, the headlines, almost without exception in the newspapers that I read, said, scientists say global warming trend not in evidence, or something to that effect. That's not what the scientists intended to say. What they were trying to warn against was not to look at the 10 years and say this represents a trend. But what we have seen, and this is not disputable, is that 6 of the 10 warmest years of the last century occurred during the 1980s. And that suggests, it does not prove scientifically, but it suggests at least that the warming is underway. And if one were to take a poll of the world's meteorologists, my guess is that almost all of them would say that it is likely that the warming has begun.
Where would you bet your bottom dollar? If you were president, having to choose between conflicting evidence.
Yeah, I don't think the evidence is so conflicting for those who are prepared to be objective. For those who don't want to do anything, there's enough uncertainty that it can be seized upon to avoid doing anything, and that's what I think we're seeing with a lot of political leaders. And I think we're clearly seeing that in the White House. But there's not much doubt in my mind but that the warming is underway. I think the odds are at least 10 to 1 that that's the case. And if the 80s are the beginning of the warming, and if the hot summers in the 80s, if that trend continues into the 90s, then we could be facing a food emergency in the world within the next few years.
You say that the politicians seem reluctant to act, and I suggest that they are so because the constituency, despite the publicity around Earth Day, the constituency isn't mobilized because a lot of people still say, look, I like the way of life that creates the problems that Lester Brown and other environmentalists deplore. I like my cars, I like my clothes, I like throwaway containers. I like this way of life. I
think most of us have at least that inclination. Most of us, certainly I, don't like to change. If I have established behavior, and it takes some effort to get me to change. And I think that's true for most people. I think the thing that's going to change behavior dramatically is when people begin to see that the lifestyles they now enjoy are not sustainable. I mean, we are in fact part of an environmentally unsustainable global economy.
How can you say that with such certainty? Because we all know that it could be, but we also know human behavior changes trends and diverts them in other directions. Right. Why do you say that with such certainty?
If we change trends, then I think we'll be all right. But that's the point. We have to make some dramatic changes in a very short period of time. For example, there's no question but that if we continue to burn fossil fuels and increase the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it will lead to global warming. Now, there is debate about how fast the warming will occur, whether it'll be 3 degrees or 8 degrees hotter a generation or two from now. There's a question about what the specific effects will be in various parts of the world, but there's no disagreement on the basic physics. If you put more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it traps the heat going out from the Earth. And as I look at the world economy and ask the question, what if these trends continue? What if we continue to deforest the Earth? What if we continue to deplete the ozone layer? What if we continue to pump greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? What will happen? And what I think we're already beginning to see is a slowdown in world food production during the late 80s that is likely to continue into the 90s.
Because?
Because of soil erosion. I mean, for example, the world's farmers are losing about 24 billion tons of topsoil a year from their cropland. That's about the amount of topsoil in Australia's wheatland.
It's
not inconsequential.
You can't grow as much wheat.
You can't grow as much wheat. So each year, the world's farmers are now trying to feed 88 million more people with 24 billion fewer tons of topsoil than they had the year before. You don't have to be an agronomist to understand that those two trends cannot both continue indefinitely. And I am as convinced as I can be that the trends of environmental degradation that we're now seeing, that we've been talking about, cannot continue much longer without the world economy being in trouble.
But how do you reach the masses of people if the environmental movement remains in this country as it is, essentially lily white, and composed mainly of people who are socially secure? I mean, we're living in an non-white world, and the Indians in Brazil say they don't appreciate white Europeans coming down here and white Americans and telling us, appointing themselves guardians of our land. That we want an economy that's going to produce a way of life for our children, not unlike that which you have had in Europe and America. How do you reach people? How do you reach the coal miners in West Virginia who are disaffected by the recent Clean Air Act that's going to put their sons out of jobs, sons who would normally have expected to take on the life of the coal miner and carry it forward into the next generation? How are you going to reach those people?
A lot of people are being reached by environmental indicators, environmental conditions that are deteriorating already. For example, in the In Louisiana, there's a so-called chemical or cancer corridor. And
Odor Alley, it's called, because you can just smell the odor from
a lot of low-income people, a lot of black communities are really up in arms protesting this because they see the health effects on their children and themselves. It's not too different than Eastern Europe, where they're now beginning to realize that they've got serious environmental problems. Air pollution, water pollution, to a degree that it's actually reducing life expectancy in many of the cities in Eastern Europe, in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland. Male life expectancy in both Poland and the Soviet Union has fallen in recent years, and apparently partly because of environmental pollution and workplace exposure to hazardous chemicals. So a lot of people are being affected in one way or another. But the thing that I think is really going to rally people, what I think is likely to be the Pearl Harbor in the battle to save the planet, will be the next year in which we have severe heat and drought in the United States. At that point, I think we'll begin to realize that we have to make some course corrections.
Perhaps it will take the equivalent of a Pearl Harbor. What if it takes some major, grave ecological strike before we wake up?
If I had to guess now, I would guess that we're not more than a few years from a world food emergency. One where food prices would increase to the degree that they would lead to political instability in many countries in the world, including industrial as well as developing. Creating a situation, for example, where American consumers would be competing with Japanese consumers for our grain, but American consumers having only a weak dollar to compete in the world marketplace against a strong yen, for example. Imagine the political problems that would arise from that. Or consider what happens to the international monetary system, the international banking structure. If third world countries, faced with soaring world grain prices, use all their foreign exchange to try and import food to avoid starvation and maintain political stability, they'll literally forget debt payments. We could be only 1 year away from a situation in which these issues would have to be considered.
That kind of doomsday talk does frighten some people, but it
I'm not sure it's doomsday talk. I think it's a realistic scenario based on a very detailed analysis of what's happening in the world.
We've had a long time now in which societies have gauged their success on materialism, on the possession of goods. Self-worth is often determined by one's possession of goods, just as national greatness is determined by the gross national product, which is composed of all of those goods. And you're really challenging the materialistic life that we have developed in the West. Are you opposed to materialism?
I'm not challenging it. Nature is challenging it. And I think what nature is saying, that we cannot continue the trends of destruction of our life support systems that have been underway now for the last few decades. I mean, you can create your own scenario. Ask yourself what happens if we keep pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and the temperature of the Earth keeps rising over time. What happens if summers get hotter and hotter in North America, for example? What happens to agriculture? What happens if we continue deforesting the Earth? What happens if we continue to accumulate toxic waste in the environment? What happens to the health of people everywhere? You don't have to be terribly imaginative to run these scenarios through. And I'm not saying that disaster is inevitable, but I'm saying that if we don't act quickly to begin reversing some of these trends, then the world is in trouble.
What if the survival of the human species is not intrinsically a part of the laws of nature? What if God, nature, assigned to our interest no greater claims than that given the dinosaurs? I mean, what happens? The assumption is human beings must survive. Why?
I think most of us have an innate desire to want to maintain ourselves as a species, to maintain civilization. But it seems to me, as one who spends most of his waking time trying to analyze what's happening in the world, that the trends of the last few decades cannot continue without jeopardizing our future. We're not saying that we're going to make it, But what we are saying that if we do make it, there are certain things that we have to do. And it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy because it's going to require a change in behavior, a lot of change in behavior in a very short period of time. If we're going to stabilize population growth in time, it's going to require quite literally a revolution in human reproductive behavior. If we're going to stabilize climate, then we've got to get on with phasing out fossil fuels.
Is there any society that is now has achieved a sustaining economy?
No country has an environmentally sustainable economic system. There are a number of countries that have pieces of it, but no country that has all the pieces. And we will not have all the pieces in place until we get a cooperative international effort to stabilize climate, protect biological diversity, protect the ozone layer, for example. So no national economy today, even if it's doing all the right things at the national level, can have an environmentally sustainable economic system unless the entire world is working together.
What does it say to you that in the Eastern Bloc, the communist bloc, where the state was dominant, wealth was not permitted, there was a centralized economy, pollution has been worse than it has been in the capitalist countries? What does that say to you?
One of the things it says is that the socialist planners, I think, are somewhat naive in their judgment of human nature. And the assumption was that people who were socially motivated when they were building factories and managing them would be concerned about pollution. But we in the Western world, in the capitalist world, have not made that assumption. We know that people are, that there's a certain amount of greed in any population. And so what we've done is tried to build in safeguards to respond to that. And so we have controls on pollution, for example. And what they're beginning to realize in Eastern Europe is that man is not yet quite as perfect as they assume. And so they've discovered that production quotas can create at least as much pollution as the profit motive. But there's a more fundamental lesson, I think, from Eastern Europe. What I think we've seen over the last year, in this year of political transformation, a transformation that none of us could have imagined a year ago, is that suddenly it became clear to almost everyone in those societies that not only was the economic system not working, but that it was an inherently unworkable system. And when they realized that, then it was only a matter of time. I think Gorbachev himself realized that, and that really set things in motion. So there was an inherent contradiction in that system, and they finally recognized it and responded to it. The parallel at the global level is that there is an inherent contradiction between the economic indicators, the economic trends that we read about in the daily press, and the environmental trends. The economic system of which we're a part is sowing the seeds of its own demise. And as that contradiction becomes more apparent, I think we may see social change and economic change as a result on a scale that we've not seen during our lifetimes.
In the meantime, where most of us live, what can we each do to contribute to this change that leads to the actual as opposed to the perceived rescue of the environment? Individual things.
There are limits to how much we can do. We're now faced with a need for systemic changes. You and I can conserve energy in every way we can think of, but as long as the economic system is based on fossil fuels that are driving the warming of the planet, then we won't solve the problem. And we have to become politically active in pushing our governments at various levels to begin to phase out fossil fuels and move toward alternatives. If more of us do not become politically active, we're not going to make it. There's too much inertia in the system, too many vested interests. We're faced with a need for an enormous amount of change in a very short period of time. The only historically similar mobilization that I can think of would be that which occurred during the early 40s as we mobilized for war.
I don't quarrel with that, but it does seem to me that the environment is not just the moral equivalent of war, as Henry James said, but then it might be the economic equivalent of war, and that there are some things the market can do that coercion cannot do.
The market has much to be said for it, and it behaves with an intelligence that centrally planners can never match. The question is not whether we want to harness the energies of the marketplace and the intelligence, the rationality of the marketplace. We do. If we don't, we won't make it. But at the same time, we have to provide guidance to the marketplace. The market on its own will not protect oceanic fisheries. The market on its own will not stabilize climate. The market on its own will not protect forests. And so we have to get a balance between letting the market do well the things that it does best, but recognizing that public policy has to fill the gaps. If we're going to bring about change, comprehensive change in the time that's available.
The next decade will get us to the year 2000. You think we can change that fast?
We may. We have done it before when the threat has become clear. We mentioned earlier that Pearl Harbor mobilized this country, galvanized energies. I mean, one day men were working in offices and factories, the next day they were in military training camps. Women who had been at home were working on assembly lines. One day Chrysler was making automobiles, the next day it was making tanks. Suddenly we were rationing scarce commodities. We literally restructured the economy in order to support the war effort. And that's the kind of restructuring that we're going to have to think about if we're going to protect the environmental support systems on which our economic future depends.
From New York, this has been a conversation with Lester Brown. I'm Bill Moyers.
Funding for this program was provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, a catalyst for change. Corporate underwriting was provided by
Weeknights on the McNeil-Lair News Hour.
This is WMFE TV, Channel 24 Orlando, offering only the best for 25 years.
One summer, one American summer, this Mexican kid read Huck Finn, and I almost gave up, and I was trailing Huck, and I couldn't follow the dialect. And then Jim comes in, and I couldn't follow that, and I was losing my footing on the levee, and suddenly, somewhere in the middle of that book, I caught sight of the river. And that river is America, and it is mine.
In the next half hour, An American Story with Richard Rodriguez. I'm Bill Moyers.
A World of Ideas with Bill Moyers. Funding for this program is provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, a catalyst for change. Corporate underwriting is provided by General Motors and its Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac, GMC truck divisions, and GMAC. General Motors, committed to excellence.
Richard Rodriguez was born in San Francisco in 1944.
the son of working-class immigrant parents from Mexico. He spoke only a few words of English when he started school, but went on to become a highly prized, quote, minority student. With degrees from Stanford and Columbia universities, he studied in London as a Fulbright scholar. But while pursuing his doctorate at Berkeley, he suddenly walked away from a promising career in academia. Despite his ambition to teach, Richard Rodriguez rebelled against job offers which he says were coming his way just because of his Hispanic surname. He became a freelance writer and in 1982 published Hunger of Memory, an autobiography about how education had altered his life. Some critics condemned him for having forsaken his roots and for his negative views of affirmative action and bilingual education. But he was praised by many others for his intimate understanding of the impact of language on life. I talked to Richard Rodriguez recently when he visited New York.
You once said that of all the people you listened to most intently, you listened to young blacks from the ghetto, because you said you admired their brazen intimacy.
Yeah. I guess what I've always heard of American blacks doing, in some sense, on buses, for example, when they raise their voice against the crowd, is insisting on their separateness. And something like the way, as a boy, I used to use Spanish as a way of keeping you away. There's a great pleasure in intimacy and a great pleasure in separateness. And it's a pleasure that people who are dispossessed and people who are kept separate learn to love. The problem is that, of course, when you transfer that language into the public realm, that you already change it, that the black language of intimacy spoken among blacks, overheard by a non-black, becomes a language of separateness. I mean, we hear it very differently.
That's why you have opposed bilingual education. For example, you took on the black activist who thought that black English should be used in schools.
Well, I guess I would say that I've opposed the ideological implications of bilingual education, by which I mean, in less fancy terms. Whenever people talk to me about using family language in the classroom, that's when I shudder. I don't think classrooms are for family language. I think that by and large what would happen to me as a boy coming to a bilingual class, for example, is that I would have had to relearn Spanish. Because by and large, the Spanish of my home was family Spanish. The distinction between family, intimate circle, private language, and public language are very severe for me. And I don't like it when teachers start denying that distinction. I acknowledge that teachers and parents should work together to get the child over that long border between the two worlds. But I think that border has to be maintained. I think those are separate worlds. When I hear educators talking about using family language in the classroom, what I want to say immediately is that there's no way that's possible. That there is no way family language exists in the classroom. Impersonations exist, but not family language.
Because it's not a family.
It's not a family. Yes, you may get the teacher to trust you more by using Spanish. Yes, you may get the student to feel less alienated by hearing Spanish. But the basic lesson of education will be postponed, perhaps denied, perhaps postponed forever, and that is that education is a separation from family, is a movement into another world. When the Irish nun wrote on the board, Richard Rodriguez, it was curious to me because I'd never heard my name pronounced that way. I'd never seen it spelled. Then when she said to me, say it after me, that was curious too, because no one had ever asked me to say it in a public place. She said, speak it to all the boys and girls. Well, boys and girls already is to introduce me into a world of the classroom so foreign to me as a so-called minority child that I simply wasn't able to do it.
How did she pronounce it?
That was my problem. The pronunciation wasn't the problem. It was that I didn't feel that I needed to speak to you. Do you understand what I mean? I was a minority in the basic sense of that word. I didn't belong to your world. I didn't want you. I wanted to live with my grandmother. I wanted to live with in Spanish. I wanted to be clothed in it. And here was this enormous Irish woman with this cross dangling from her breast saying that I had an obligation to speak to the boys and girls. And I couldn't do it. I simply couldn't do it. I mean, when people talk to me minorities today about why don't you want to acknowledge that you're a minority, I think to myself of that boy. That boy was a minority. What he needed to do was not linguistic. It was not a linguistic breakthrough. It was a social breakthrough that he needed. He needed to believe that he had a relationship to that public space, that he belonged to public society, in the basic sense of the word minority, that he belonged to the majority.
But the argument for teaching in a bilingual program, as I understand it, is that it is a
It's a bridge. It's a facilitating, comforting bridge between the other world of strangeness into the new world of America. Doesn't that have some appeal to you?
Not particularly. I've always thought of education as a more radical process, and not so much unkind, but certainly radical, a kind of radical remaking. I've always liked the metaphor of the melting pot, because not only the kind of alchemy suggested by that, but also its violence in some way. I mean, there was a radical remaking of Richard Rodriguez. Now, it came, in my case, with a certain trauma, and which I do not recommend to anybody else. But I think a certain clarity of vision about what the classroom was. I knew what it was about quite early. And I think I've never disregarded its value.
And it was about remaking you?
It was about the public making of Richard Rodriguez, that's right. This voice that speaks now, not to boys and girls, but to ladies and gentlemen. This freedom, this enormous freedom to break out of what I call the minority culture. Now, a lot of Hispanics hear that as a betrayal of my ethnic identity. I'm not even talking ethnicity, I'm talking really class here. I'm talking something much more elemental. Ethnicity is for me a much more private, in some sense a much more theological dimension. I don't think of it as tacos and serapes and kind of weekend trips to a Mexican resort town. I think of ethnicity as having to do with my very soul and the nature of my relationship to my God. I've always thought of my Catholicism as somehow my Mexican side, and my difficulty with Mexico has also been my difficulty with the Catholic Church.
But you see, so many people are making the point that it isn't a melting pot anymore, that if anything, it's a mosaic. If it ever were a melting pot, it was a boiling cauldron in which a lot of people got hurt as well as transformed, but that it's a mosaic, many colors, many pieces, one society.
But it isn't that. I mean, my nieces and nephews have German surnames and Scottish surnames. I mean, they don't. The trouble with glass is that it stays there. I remember I was talking to a Catholic bishop, a Mexican-American in Sacramento, and he said, that's what we're like. He said, we're like that mosaic there. That's not what we're like. I mean, in fact, there are various metaphors Hispanic used to describe the new America. Another is beef stew, believe it or not. I'm not a chunk of beef. I'm not a grocery bag. That's another metaphor. I'm not a can of beans. America's fluid. It means that I don't know where I stop and you begin. I cannot predict in meeting you how I'm going to be changed. I can't decide it. It's risky to be an American. It's risky to live in San Francisco in the 1990s because I may become Chinese. I don't know. The idea that I'm a piece of glass on a mosaic, that's an appropriate metaphor, that somehow it's static, denies the basic fluid experience of our lives. It doesn't feel that way to me. I mean, the soul is not this ice cube. It's not this piece of glass. The soul is rather water. The soul is something more movable. Is something much more. I would say even. In some way, I think it's something that can be lost. In some sense, I lost my soul in America, if you want to say it that radical way.
Well, explain that. You lost your soul?
I lost my Mexican soul in America. I was enchanted by Lucille Ball and by Walt Disney and by Technicolor and by the enchantments of this culture and by the Protestant singing at the Presbyterian Church. And I didn't want Mexico. In some way, I'm terrified of Mexico. I've always thought I will die there if I go back.
Have you gone back?
Oh, yes, I go back a lot. But very recently, within the last few weeks, a friend of mine who's Mexican, who lives in Merida, who is like a lot of Mexicans I know, who is very much like my father, is very interested in death. He collects skulls. My friend goes to see, he's very interested in Maya Indians, and he went to see this Indian fortune teller. He goes to ask her about the lotto numbers for the Florida lotto. She refuses to give these numbers out, but he took along a paperback copy of my book, and he asks about me. And she said, when she sees the picture, she said, oh, great power there, great power. He said, well, what's going to happen to him? And she said, he will die in Mexico. And, which was odd, because there would be no reason for her to see this Mexican-looking face and for her to say that. And he said, well, how will he die, my friend of the skulls in his house? She said he will be murdered in Mexico. I guess I've always thought about Mexico, that Mexico's lesson is death, and that's a very wise lesson. That America needs more death in its culture, that I think that we could learn from Mexico in that sense.
What does your father think of you now? Are you still his son?
That's a good question. I've always been his closest child. That is, I've always been the person with whom he's argued, which is to say, the person with whom he's insisted on a kind of intellectual familiarity. And we've taken this argument in over the years as our kind of love bond. He insisting, he who left Mexico during the revolution, during the late parts of the revolution, for Catholic Mexico was undergoing an anti-Catholic persecution, where his well-to-do uncle was hiding priests like Tudor England in cupboards and in closets. My father remembering Mexicans fighting outside of the door of the house with knives into the dark, remembering the kind of the mad display of violence in Mexico, remembering the kind of a priest swinging from a rope on a tree in Mexico, and never wanting to go back to that country. Never. I mean, I say to him, "Do you not miss it? Do you not want to go back? What is there to miss?"
So he's American.
He's American, but in the basic sense, he is Mexican in the sense that he's a carrier of what Mexico knows, and that is that it will come to nothing. That it is tragic, and that he looks around America and he is not convinced of it. My father, who put his kids through college and who achieved a two-story house and his big blue DeSoto and his stereo television combination. My father, who has seen his daughters go off to junior proms and his sons go off in tuxedos. My father, who was surrounded by false teeth grinning at him when he was making them all over the years. My father would say, if in fact he would hear you say, as many people have told him, "You've achieved so much in this country," my father laughs. At the illusion that he's achieved anything at all.
You grew up Catholic, as you've said, where religious faith was expressed through, and feelings were expressed through ritual. Latin Mass, I assume.
Yes, Latin.
Do you still go to Mass?
Absolutely. I would go every week.
In English?
Well, I go in English because it's the most convenient language. It's the most convenient vernacular language, and I guess I would go in Latin. I mean, I would be like Yves Lenoir. I would probably go to the Latin Mass in America if there was such a thing.
There is now. You have to go to a ritual of words, not of symbols.
That's right.
Isn't your soul hungry for metaphors?
It's very hungry for magic. It's very hungry for ritual. I think the church is in a very. I mean, I think for all kinds of good reasons. The church is in a very bad state right now, liturgically. I think that the church has gotten involved with the world in urgent ways and is asking very important social questions about our society. But I think we've lost the basic understanding of religious practice, which is that it begins on your knees. It begins with the assertion of, "I believe." It begins in the cry of the night to God. And unless you find adequate languages, adequate hymns, adequate ways of doing that, everything else goes very pale after a while.
When you go to church these days, are you forced, as we were as children, to recognize something about yourself?
I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. The question I would like you to ask me, but I'm glad that you haven't, is the question, do I pray? Because I don't know what I pray. I don't have the concentration for prayer that I have for, say, writing, when I can intensely concentrate on the text in front of me when I write. I can't pray that way anymore, and that's the thing that frightens me most. I don't know, perhaps I'm not even using my own church to its deepest consolation. I know I'm distracted a great deal, and I think about I find it restful. I'm horrified that I come out of church, and I know no one, I should say, I know very few friends who go to church, and very few friends who are Christians. It seems that one of the interesting things about religion is not only that it's communal, by which I mean that it has to be done, and there has to be it has something to do with community at its deepest, with the we, with the connection to gravestones and to children yet unborn.
Faith is a lonely.
It's lonely. That's right. That's the other half of it.
And going to church does make you realize you may be lonely, but you're not isolated.
That's right. That's right. But when you exist as I think most Christians do increasingly in the secular city, it's a different experience of religion, and it seems to me pre-medieval in some sense. I come out and here are these 35-year-old people dressed as children, jogging past in purple shorts and leotards or on bicycles. On San Francisco on a Sunday morning, between Croissant and 60 Minutes is this kind of celebration of, I don't know what it is, body or youth or carelessness.
Now.
Yes.
Now.
And I wonder about the spirituality of the culture I live in. Yeah, I think we are entering a post-Christian age in America, and I think we are beginning to ask questions now that we didn't ask 50 years ago, even in the kind of the 19th century age of agnosticism.
What questions?
I think of the way we are asking questions about whether or not there's a distinction between dolphins and my grandmother, and whether I can make a distinction between them, whether the basic questions about the environmental movement and what the earth is here for, and what my place in the world is. The questions we're asking about abortion. I think we're moving to a post-religious level of rhetoric now, which see, as a Catholic, now I don't think there's a Catholic position on capital punishment, but as a Catholic, I do not think that the worst thing that can happen to a person, a criminal, is to be executed. I think the worst thing that can happen to any of us is to be damned. That the final judgment is God's judgment, not man's judgment. Well, in a secular society, the worst thing that can happen to any of us is capital punishment. Is that moment of death. The fact of death is going to ring differently for us. The fact of life is ringing differently for us now. I live in a city, this Chinese city of mine, which is now a city in which death is at the door.
Because of AIDS?
AIDS. I know a number of people who are dying of AIDS, and in fact, I know about 20 or 30 people right now, which is a lot of people to know. And it's not so much that I know a lot of people who are dying. I know a lot of young people who are dying. It's changed my opinion of youth. I don't look at young bodies anymore the way I used to, as a kind of defense against death. The AIDS epidemic came at the peak of what was in San Francisco certainly this utopian outburst. Many Americans would see it as this great period of pagan decadence, where for men and women who'd suffered sexual persecution in Kansas, in Iowa, and Illinois, had come on the Greyhound bus to San Francisco, and there was this immature explosion. You couldn't get enough sex. You couldn't be out late enough, and people thought they'd found paradise, and suddenly there was death at the door. The lessons of death, the lessons of sorrow that have come to San Francisco, that have come to the gay community in San Francisco, are really astonishing, because when you have sorrow, what you suddenly have is you have a we. You suddenly have people holding together. You suddenly have the necessity for communal existence, which is what, of course, ancient cultures always know.
Is it possible that in this increasing and pervasive awareness of death that you describe in San Francisco and other cities here in New York as a result of AIDS, that the soul of Mexico still has something to teach America?
Oh, indeed. I think in a way as America ages, for example, and as we end up slower and our eyesight gives way, I think we are going to learn of necessity the lessons of Mexico. That life is not all youth, that life was not all new beginnings. We are going to miss the consolation of continuity, the fact that we live so far from home, or what we remember as home. We are going to feel alone in the city. I think in some way, the environmental movement's insistence on the we is this desperate cry of America at the other ends of modernity, telling the pre-modern world, don't come this way. Literally, don't do what we did to the plains. Don't do what we did to the forests. Don't do what we did to our birds and to our lakes. Save the forest. Save the sky. You can't tell that to someone who's never had. On the other hand, I think that we may have the irony of ironies, America's destiny, which was once to play the kind of the piper to the children of the world. We may become the old men of the world, the old prophets, warning people away from modernity.
That is the Indian in you speaking. That is the Mexican in you speaking.
Oh, yeah. But you see, that isn't exactly what the biculturalists or what the Hispanics want me to say. I mean, what they want is something. They want something. They want me to be better. They want me to be Jesse Jackson. They want me to talk about how we want to get jobs in the city and how we want to get better housing and how we want to, You know, we want to be proud of Spanish, and and we have a contribution to make in the society. We want to be one of the stones in the mosaic. And
You do want those things.
yes, but that's not primarily how I see myself. I see myself as a much more subversive, a much dreamier sort of person. I was a very sad child. I was a very melancholic child. I was a child much like a fat girl with bad acne. I mean, I read a great deal, and that's who I am. I've lived by myself a long time. I like long summers. I used to read with little old men who had green visors in the Clooney Library in Sacramento, and they would read faded newspapers from Detroit and from Philadelphia, and I would read these extraordinary novels. I wanted to know about Texas. I wanted to know about where you were. I wanted to be Texan. One day I remember I read William Saroyan, and I found out that I was Armenian. I'd never known that I was Armenian. And then I read James Baldwin, and Baldwin, young Jimmy Baldwin, had written this book of essays called Nobody Knows My Name. It was the first time I read Baldwin. I found out that I was black. No one had told me that I was black. And then I didn't want to read, although the nuns kept pushing it on me, but I did not read Mark Twain until I was in high school because I thought it was a kid's book. And I wanted to read adult books when I was a kid because I was so precocious. And first of all, I didn't understand. I'd never understood kids' book. I didn't understand the language of a kid's book. You know, I couldn't read Winnie the Pooh. I didn't understand what it was all about. One summer, one American summer, this Mexican kid read Huck Finn, and I almost gave up, and I was trailing Huck, and I couldn't follow the dialect. And then Jim comes in, and I couldn't follow that, and I was losing my footing on the levee, and suddenly, somewhere in the middle of that book, I caught sight of the river. And that river is America, and it is mine. One of the things I deeply resent about the ethnic movement in America in the last few years is that it has denied me the possibility of being Irish, of being Chinese. I want to be more than myself. I've always wanted that.
But you're talking about the imagination, and ethnicity is a matter of fact. It is a matter of birth, boundaries, inheritance, place.
Writers are always rebels against imagination. I'm always wondering what the woman feels as she's giving birth to the child. I'm always wondering what that moment is like on the other side of death. I'm always wondering what it is like. My Negroes when I was in the 1950s were rich people, rich white people. I always wondered what they were like. I've always wanted to know what the insides of the great hotels was. So the first time I had any money, I went off to New York and stayed in the Carlisle Hotel. And I was in college, and I was staying at the Carlisle Hotel and going to hear Bobby Short. And there he was singing white music, singing black music to this upper-class white audience. And I thought, this is heaven. I have trespassed the boundary. I've gone to a foreign country.
You always wanted to be where you weren't and wanted what you didn't have. I mean, that's very American.
Very American, and I think I think rebellious the way writers are rebellious. We're not nice people. I am not the role model. Never was, never intend to be. I am the last gringo in America.
Well, tell this gringo who thinks he may be the last gringo in America how to deal with the coming of the future. I mean, where I grew up, Hispanics are now increasing in number 5 times as fast as we are. In California, Mexico's children are the population of the future. What does an old gringo do?
You are Mexico's children. What I would ask Americans to be is to be brave. I mean, what I fear is that Americans are afraid of themselves and are afraid of each other, and that we are really going to retrench in the next few years. And we are going to use ethnicity for exactly, not the celebration of the mosaic, which it never was, but rather the old xenophobic assertion that we are separate, that we are each discrete entities in this country. We are not discrete entities. I am your brother. I remember once I was on a speakers bureau when I was studying in England at the American Embassy. The American Embassy had a speakers bureau, and they would get requests from different groups they wanted a Yank to come out and so forth. So I would always go out to one of these Rotary societies in one of these small towns in England, and we would sit around in the pub beforehand, and they would always be waiting for the Yank to arrive. I was there. But they always imagined that somehow the Yank was some astronaut, you know, that he was going to come in and he was crew cut and he was blonde and so forth and so on. I am the Yank. I am the American. And a lot of people it's going to take some time to get used to that idea that Americans look like me.
We'll continue this conversation with Richard Rodriguez on another edition of A World of Ideas. I'm Bill Moyers.
Funding for this program was provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, a catalyst.
The area's largest